Jorvik sat in the shade of a gravel embankment. Striper curled on his lap, purring like a drill wheel. He buried his fingers in her thick fur. At this time of the summer, the stream bed was dry. The spring melts were long past, and the sun was harsh. He liked to sleep through the heat of the days rather than sweat and burn. In the mountains, there weren't as many direct hours of sunshine, but around noon the bright light and heat could be oppressive. For weeks he'd been following the cave runes carved into trees and chiseled on exposed rock along the river, left there to guide him. Striper was a long-haired mine runner, a breed of cat raised by dwarves to keep pests away from their workings and supplies. In Dwarvish, the phrase was Ulan Rinler, but oftentimes people called the cats the Ulan Rinlin, a play on words meaning mine captain, for the cats seemed to view the dwarves as the interlopers. Some said that the dwarves had learned to keep cats from the humans, but Jorvik didn't care about the distant past. The cat had birthed a litter in the spring, and now he carried the kittens on his back in a wooden cage. Striper ran free, keeping close to him as he trudged, but he couldn't trust the kittens to do the same. Carrying 8 kittens was an awful hassle, but Jorvik's mother had bred these cats, and he liked them. The cats in his family's hold had always curled up on them when they slept, purring and kneading with their paws. They made Jorvik feel less alone, so far from anything, so isolated in the wilderness for weeks on end. He had expected to find the claim 50 miles ago or more, but still the runes led on. Thankfully, he'd come prepared. His gear weighed over 200 pounds, and for the first 2 months it was all he could do to make 10 miles a day. Already miner strong, he had hardened even more as the summer wore on. He could hear the river water swirling around boulders not far away. It was low ebb in the summer, but still it made a din. "Oi!" someone shouted. Jorvik sprang from his warm stupor. Striper yowled as her claws came out, trying to cling to Jorvik's pants but failing as he spun, reaching reflexively to the knife at his belt. Then he saw the figure on the gravel embankment, a dwarf carrying deep wooden buckets in each hand. It was Savyarm. "Sav!" Jorvik shouted, spreading his arms wide. Savyarm laughed loud, then looked over his shoulder. He set the buckets down and slid down the gravel on his buttocks. The 2 dwarves embraced, slapping each other's backs. Dust rose from their clothes. "You nearly missed us," Savyarm said, extending his arms to hold Jorvik where he could look at him. "How? I saw no markers." "None? There is a waystone not 100 yards yonder." Savyarm nodded toward the river. Jorvik had followed the dry creek away from the river seeking shelter for a rest. It might have caused him to miss the claim entirely if Savyarm hadn't stumbled upon him. "Where are the others?" Savyarm asked. "They did not come." "What?" Savyarm's smile faltered. "You came alone?" "Ah, yes." "That was not—" His friend paused. Jorvik knew what he would have said. A wise choice. "At least you're here safely," Savyarm finished. "I'm sure you'll hear about it." From his brother, Jorvik knew. He'd hear it from his eldest brother, who would not hold his words like Savyarm. Jorvik glanced at the buckets on the embankment. "Do you not have mine water?" "Oh, yes, we do, but—" "Well, look." The 2 scrambled up the embankment, and Jorvik realized his confusion as soon as he looked in the bucket. There were fish swimming inside, quite a few fish, both silverskins and real eyes. "Ah, do you have a fishery already?" "No, we're not that far along, but there's a stream anyway. It's why we picked it. Come along." Savyarm picked up his buckets, his biceps barely flexing. At the top of the gravel bank, Jorvik could see the worn footpath running along the top. How close he'd been to missing it. Such a mistake would be easy so far into the wilderness. He would have gone until he realized the runes had stopped, then had to backtrack. He wondered how long he would have wandered. Savyarm led them on a quarter-mile trek from the river, following the dry creek, except that as they went, the creek looked less and less dry. Here a dell opened in the mountain, or rather a hollow sank into the ridge. On the north side of the hollow rose a sheer rock face. There was a trickle of water now at the bottom of the creek bed, but Jorvik could hear running water ahead. The mountain rose high above the dell. In truth, it was not a massive mountain. It was more of an extended ridge rising only 5,000 feet or so. Yet along the crests of the ridges rose hard cluster spires, balds, and pinnacles of ancient stone, where the rain of the ages had washed away the sandstone and left only the jagged teeth of intrusive basalt cones and vents and the odd granite jaw. Such interplays of disparate rock were attractive to prospectors, for it showed that during the cataclysm, mighty forces were at work there forging different materials, the kind of forces and materials that also created ores and crystals and precious gems. It was this composition of folded ridges and valleys, cut through with rivers full of trout, silverskins, rilleys, and other species, that made up the landscape for scores upon scores of miles. And the rivers were full of banks of tiny garnets and plenty of color in the pan. There were lodes in the mountains, and no mistake. The dwarves had taken to calling this range the Red Ridges for the garnets, but it could as well be called the Green Ridges, for the range was covered in dense forest in the heart of an otherwise sparse and dry country, where elves and men had yet to assert dominion, and the foul beasts of the firmament were sparse, sparser than some places at least. They came up a short rise where narrow, smooth steps were carved into the stone to make the climb easy. A mountain brook flowed down a short run of sluices and into a tailings pond. From further up the dell, another stream trickled down over a path of boulders. The near side of the dell was dammed with tailings, and a pool had backed up behind. Tree trunks rose from the dark, still water. Only a small trickle escaped over the dam to continue down the gravel creek bed. A few yards above the sluices, the brook flowed out of a channel carved in the middle of a narrow mine adit. Another dwarf stepped from the mine carrying a heavy sack over each shoulder, obscuring his peripheral vision. Without looking around, he walked to the sluices. The dwarf emptied a sack of crushed rock into the top of the first sluice box. Jorvik didn't miss the long punch dagger hanging ready at the dwarf's belt. It was long enough almost to be one of the human short swords. Punch daggers were dwarven sidearms, made of a triangular blade with 3 sharpened sides, mostly meant for stabbing in tight spaces. Jorvik had a similar though shorter version tucked against his lower back. His rock pick and wood axe had doubled as his other weapons during the long trek. Jorvik knew the third dwarf as he would know each of the dwarves at the claim. It was Hobblefoot, Jorvik's eldest cousin. Saviarm was not a relative but a good friend of Hobblefoot's from their apprentice days. There were 5 other dwarves here already, or should be. "Oi!" Saviarm shouted again. Hobblefoot turned and looked, and his gaze snapped to Jorvik. "Chargrim!" Hobblefoot shouted. Jorvik grinned. Chargrim was Jorvik's common name. Dwarves were given hidden names by their parents, but these were not shared or known except to a husband and wife, or perhaps close siblings. Instead, common names were given for daily use, often due to some characteristic or event. Jorvik had earned his moniker after falling into a pit of powdered charcoal the year before his rundal, his coming of age, and not enjoying the laughter of his companions when he climbed back out. Hobblefoot had been there for it. Hobblefoot and Jorvik met halfway and embraced, slapping each other on the back. Hobblefoot was a broad dwarf, built like the miner he was, and he wore a thick leather apron. "Your brother will be relieved to see you." Hobblefoot glanced down the path. "Where are the others?" "He came alone," Saviarm said. "What?" Jorvik sighed. "They wouldn't come, not yet, but I was not about to remain. Have you all been well?" Hobblefoot looked a stone lighter than he had before. "Alone?" Hobblefoot ignored Jorvik's question. "Alone?" "Your brother will have words about that. It was not a wise choice." "But you're all well." "Ah, yes," Hobblefoot said. "The winters are harder here than the flats, but we were able to scrape by. It's not the Kara-Indal." "It's not the Kara-Indal," both Jorvik and Saviarm intoned in standard response. The Kara-Indal mountain range lay at least 1,000 miles and many generations of dwarves away. None of them, or their great-great-grandparents, had ever seen them, not since the beginning of the age of Tourmaline. Still, it was a common saying if anything was ever less than ideal or was paradoxically easy. There was a meow, and Hobblefoot looked down at his leg as Striper rubbed against his shin, her tail arced. Well, would you look at this? Hobblefoot said. Why am I not surprised? He looked back to Jorvig. Come, let's take you to your brother. The smell of sandstone flowed out of the mine audit, along with the cool sense of underground mineral-laden water, mixing with the smell of fish rising from Saviarm's buckets. As soon as Jorvig stepped into the comforting security of the dim audit, he could hear the grind and rumble of a water wheel ahead. The audit continued 20 yards into the mountain before doors opened on each side. Beyond one was a storeroom, and in the other spun a water wheel 10 feet in diameter, with a small pond behind it. Savvy was right. It was not suitable for a fishery. It was too small, and the fish could escape through the stream that flowed over the water wheel. The stream itself bubbled out of a gap in a granite vein in the chamber wall. Thankfully, the gap appeared to angle upward rather than down. Better to have the water source up than down, though it may still be an artesian well drawing on a lower aquifer. Or the water above could have carved out chambers or weakened the stone. Wet mines were poor places to live, as necessary as water was. Hopefully it was not extensive. This was a typical edit for a new mine claim, with the opposing rooms and, when a stream was available, the water wheel. The wheel could be used for powering machinery, pumping air, and even draining water from any lower levels. It was odd that there was no machinery yet, and Jorvig wasn't sure why they had built the wheel so soon. At the junction of the chambers, Savvy set down his buckets, and Jorvig lowered his pack to the stone. Striper meowed, asking to be rubbed, but Jorvig ignored her. He checked on the kittens in the cage, looked around, and shrugged. He untwisted the little latch and opened the gate. The kittens were curled in a heap in the corner of the cage. They'd made it here. They may as well explore. At first, none of the kittens made to move towards the opening, and so Jorvik left them there to figure it out. They had all made it here. What a relief. Dwarves didn't keep pets, at least not just for the sake of having them. These cats would live 25 years at best, and for dwarves who could live to 10 times that age, animals were transient. But if an animal had a use, the dwarves would keep them, and Jorvig had come to enjoy having the little beasts around. The 3 dwarves continued on down the drift, past 4 sleeping alcoves carved into the rock walls. Up ahead, the stratified sandstone was braced with rough-hewn timbers, where a seam creased the rock, showing mineral crystallizations and yellow sulfides, where water and oxygen must have weathered the stone. A shaft opened at the end of the drift, and the top of a ladder protruded next to block and tackles for raising loads from below. He could hear the sounds of mining rising up. We decided to follow this seam down, Hobblefoot said. That made sense. At the angle it was moving through the rock, it would head towards the surface of the mountainside above after a few hundred feet if it continued. They climbed down the ladder, passing 50 feet further into the stone. At the bottom, an oil wick burned in a clay dish, casting a pale yellow light. Jorvig crinkled his nose at the rancid smell of the lamp. They were burning animal oil made from boiled fat. It almost overpowered the smell of disturbed minerals. Jorvig's eyes were still adjusting from the harsh surface light, but already he could see well enough. There was a hopper attached by an iron hook to the pulley system above. The hopper was half full of broken rock. "Oi, Sledgefist!" Hobblefoot yelled. The sound of pick and shovel stopped. The 3 dwarves, well-dusted, looked up from the back of the drift where they had exposed the load-bearing seam. Jorvig's brother Sledgefist turned, his face dripping with the sweat and grime of toil. He saw his little brother, and his teeth shone in a smile. "Ha!" he called, dropping his shovel and striding over. The other 2 dwarves followed behind, and embraces went round. "Where are the others?" Sledgefist asked. He grabbed Jorvig by the shoulder, a brotherly gesture, but one that displayed Sledgefist's mighty grip. Sledgefist had gained his moniker in his youth back in Deep Cut for his propensity for brawls. That impulse, though not the capability, had mostly left him as he grew toward his prime. "They didn't come." "What do you mean they didn't come?" Sledgefist's smile faded. "They said it was too early, and if they were going to venture this far, they would like to see specimens first." "That's not what they said to me before we left." Sledgefist snapped. I know, Jorvig said, but sometimes folk prefer to disagree with me than with you. Sledgefist stared at Jorvig blankly for a moment, and then grinned, pulling Jorvig back into a hug before pushing him to arm's length again. Then who came with you? I came alone. You half-witted mind grub, Sledgefist said. You could have died and no one would have known it. I would never have allowed it. I'm here and you weren't there. Sledgefist squinted. Is that limonite? Jorvig asked. Sledgefist looked back over his shoulder. Ah, yes, a plentiful load for what it's worth. Is that what you're after? No, not specifically. We'll see better, but at least there will be plenty of use for it ourselves. This ridge slope is cut through with seams and folds and indicator minerals, all the way to the top. Sledgefist motioned with his finger. Lots of activity here. It's the best spot we saw since we left. Plenty of color in the pan moving up the creek, Hobblefoot said. The most promising we've seen. Don't worry, cousin, Shineboot said. It was Hobblefoot's younger brother. This is the spot. We know that already. Jorvig nodded and grinned. He had no reason not to trust them. I've fish above, Saviarm cut in. Let's have a welcome feast. We'll use the last of the salt. They ate every fish that Saviarm had caught, with some snared rabbit mixed in. The fifth dwarf was Warmcoat, whose apprenticeship as a miner had overlapped with both Hobblefoot and Sledgefist. All of the dwarves in the claim, including Jorvig, had finished apprenticeships as miners. Jorvig was the youngest, and he had only finished his apprenticeship in the spring, a year after the others had decided to depart to stake their own claim. Sledgefist and the others had finished their apprenticeships 16 years before. The idea to venture off and start their own claim had been led by Hobblefoot and Sledgefist together, cousins and friends. Warmcoat was the quietest of the group, and while he had greeted Jorvig with honest welcome, he ate in silence as the others told stories of their year at the new claim. There was relatively little to tell that Jorvig couldn't have figured out, but they did their best. Hobblefoot went into great detail, interesting enough for dwarf miners, in the decision on just how to grade the adit entrance in relation to the plans for sluices. Jorvig's brother Sledgefist spent most of his words telling of the selection of the particular claim itself. And if it doesn't pay out, Jorvig asked. It will pay out. But how long if it doesn't? We have to give it 3 or 5 years at least, Sledgefist said. There are intersecting seams of quartz, and we've already gotten half an ounce of gold from crushing and sluicing. I swear there will be plenty of iron. There's pyrite in some of the upper seams. Iron was fine and good, but it wasn't scarce enough to be valuable in trade to other dwarves. Any beryl? The whole range was known for beryl. Not yet, but there were whole banks of the stuff in the creek below, as well as gold in the pan, serpentine, and even jade cobbles, lapis lazuli and traces. It had to all come from this rock face somewhere. Or further up the ridge, Hobblefoot said. Maybe carried down that vernal spring if it isn't here. Staking a claim there had given them, by dwarvish custom, ownership of the descending ridges and valleys below the nearest peak on the ridge above them, a gnarled thing of weathered granite. When dwarves searched for a claim, they looked at a number of signs. One was trace minerals in creeks and rivers. Simple panning along a waterway could indicate what minerals were weathering out of nearby rock, and how much. Rains and melts carried the minerals down from the ridges, and it was in that hard rock that the true lodes hid. Properly gauging the location of the source was tricky at best, so dwarves followed streams, swishing water and dirty gravel in wide, shallow pans at regular intervals, looking for indicator minerals and hoping to zone in on a valuable lode. Dwarves knew that eons before, the great cataclysm had fractured the surface of the land, raising up hills, shattering rock like a hammer to ice, sending vents of molten stone and gases surging upward. Some places had been touched by greater force than others, and it was signs of such activity that dwarves especially sought. Veins, seams, lodes, old vents, and caverns. In those places, the conditions were right for mineralizations and wealth, and the dell had obvious indications of significant activity in the cataclysm. The rock was fractured, almost rent in places, letting water and dissolved minerals seep in to form crystals or other precious stones. The cliff face itself showed that the mountain had been sheared. No doubt they would find ancient vents full of igneous rock. Once this has been a place of heat and power beyond comprehending. Now it was frozen in place awaiting their arrival. Millennia of rain and snow and wind had smoothed and contoured the dell, but the keen observation of the dwarves looked at the rock and saw deep history. It was a smart claim. "I'm surprised that you came alone," Sledgefist said, circling back again. "It was a damn foolish thing. We saw wolves on our way, though they stayed clear of us. And a mountain lion." "I'm here," Jorvig said. "You're lucky is what I'm saying." Jorvig knew that the journey would be dangerous, but he had decided to take his chances rather than be left behind in the worked-out mines of Deep Cut, waiting to hear something from the prospectors who had left him to finish his apprenticeship. He was supposed to join with the Hardfell brothers on the journey. Jorvig was only 40 years old, and he knew that folks would say he was just acting out of the impetuosity of youth. Maybe he was. "Did you see any sign of goblins, or—" he asked. The dwarvish word for goblin was ursi. Jorvig wasn't even willing to mention the fowler creatures said to sometimes prod into the Red Ridge's hunting game. There had been no such in the country when Tourmaline and Salt had led the dwarves into the waste, but the humans kept expanding and pushing the foul creatures into the empty spaces between their lands, just like they'd pushed the dwarves. "No," Sledgefist said, chewing on a last piece of fish and wiping his greasy fingers on his blonde beard. "Thankfully, no Ursi." Jorvig saw that a year in a wilderness had done nothing for any of their hygiene. What was more, they were all far leaner than Jorvig had remembered. His brother, always one with a big appetite, looked practically gaunt. "What did you bring with you?" Shineboot asked. He was bald, but his beard made up for the lack of hair on his head. His beard was so thick it jutted out in front, and he was a bit vain of it. It was the only beard present still oiled, though how he had kept enough beard oil about for a year in the wilderness, Jorvig didn't know. Unless he was making it. Jorvig consulted his dwarvish nose, and he did detect an unusual amount of a pine scent. "Besides mine runners," Hobblefoot added, smirking and gently booting a kitten away from the fire. "I brought 5 pounds of salt," Jorvig said. "My tools?" The others knew exactly what tools a dwarf brought into the wilds to prospect. They consisted of a rock pick, a shovel, a wood axe with a secondary pick on the reverse, a wide pan, a hammer, a case of chisels, a crowbar, and sharpening stones. And a coil of rope. One never ventured into the wilderness without rope. The weight was significant, but dwarven shoulders were broad and thick, especially after 10 years of mining in the granite seams of Deep Cut. "I tried to bring Miner's Eye, but it didn't make it. The luminescent fungi was notoriously hard to transport." "Don't worry, one of ours made it," Sledgefist said. "There's a colony starting to take root in a cut we made for it." "We hope," Warmcoat mumbled. "Let's just hope it's spores." "I also brought hand grinders in case we had specimens," Jorvig continued. "That was all I could carry besides my food." And he had reached the tail end of his food. Even so, the load had amounted to over 200 pounds spread over his body, all he could manage. The burden had slowed him. "Good," Sledgefist said. "Grinders we could use when we strike." The others nodded. Warmcoat nodded too, but it was in a drowse, drifting to sleep. "Are our folk well?" Shineboot asked. "Your sister and mother and father are well," Jorvig said. "All are well, and in truth, little enough happened. Old Kragai went to his father's." No one said anything at that news. It was hardly surprising. After a moment, Jorvig added, "And Scuttle's daughter is accepting offers," he said. "This spring." That caused all eyes but the sleeping Warmcoats to rise and gleam in the light of the foul-smelling oil lamp. "Ah," Hobblefoot said, shaking his head. "I wish we'd struck already." Jorvig slept in the storeroom that night. Striper jumped up on his chest, kneading and purring before she nestled down in his beard. Her kittens, now nearing half-grown, nestled against his legs. He would carve a sleeping alcove next to the others, starting in the morning, he told himself. The 5 dwarves who had come to the claim first had decided that each week one of them would be responsible for hunting, trapping, and fishing. Judging from the flesh missing from their bones, it was not enough. Besides the forager, another one would be responsible for breaking rock and sluicing it, and the others would mine. In some ways, Jorvig was impressed with how much they had accomplished in the 10 months or so since they'd arrived at the claim. But in other ways, he felt for the first time the weight of how much they had yet to do if they wanted to make this work. He had expected that there would be a working smithy at least, but the dwarves had been sharpening and repairing their tools under an awning made of pine branches in the dell. They had no vents yet drilled into the mountain to allow for forge fires within. They had no vents drilled because they had no drills capable of the purpose. Carrying the long metal shafts used to drill vents was hardly feasible over such a distance from deep cut. They could not make a drill because they had no smelter for the ore, and any smelting would have to be done in a bloomery outside of the mountain. Why had the others built a working water wheel before they even had machinery to drive or pumps to blow? To be continued. If the video is deleted, it will remain in the BOOSTY Mojo English dub, or if you want to support my endeavors, please subscribe to my BOOSTY in the description. Mojo English dub.